I think the emphasis, the features that were brought out had to do with metaphor. The idea, namely, that everything that we can say, all our human knowledge, certainly about the world of nature, is metaphorical, that it's not necessarily exactly the way things are, but on the contrary, the closest the imaging or picture that we can hold of the universe out there is somehow picture language reality, we would say in philosophy, metaphor. So that was one point that we came up with. Then on the other side of things, and Dr. Jones mentioned that, he referred to a new work by James Trayfield, a physicist, called The Moment of Creation, in which the emphasis was, you might almost say, on the opposite idea. The universe not amenable at all to picture language, metaphorical description that is meaningful in any sense to ordinary human beings, but of a view that is objective in the strictest sense of the term. Dr. Jones brought up the idea that Trayfield and others now say the cosmos is vast, is empty, is lifeless, is governed by chance and randomness, a kind of meaninglessness, and that the role of human beings within that universe is dubitable, to say the least, confusing, or even absurd, to use existentialist language, at worst. Now, from when I reflected on these two sets of approaches, neither necessarily those of either Dr. Jones or Dr. Ravindra, but of what may be going on in the community of cosmologists, I think we're caught in a bind. On the one hand, if we describe the universe and our place in it in terms that to us as human beings are meaningful, one might be accused of an anthropomorphic picture on the one hand. And while it's meaningful and highly even beautiful to some of us, that might be termed anthropomorphic. And to avoid that, people like Trayfield and others, and I think even Sagan is to some degree in that camp, you have so neutral and value-free a picture of the universe that it's reductionistic, mechanistic. Do we have then to choose between an anthropomorphic fairy tale view of the universe that's meaningful to us, or between a mechanistic, entirely neutral one, a techno universe, if you will, of which little can be said other than that its workings can somehow be rendered in equations. And again, what these equations are about, or whether they are about anything other than themselves, is in fact the question. And one highly respected physicist, and I think philosophical thinker, who questions this dichotomy as strenuously as do I, is the quantum physicist David Bohm, who chides physicists for not coming to terms with the question, what are these equations finally about? What is the reality out there to which they refer? And that seems to me to point to several fallacies on the part of either, perhaps, of these views. One is its picture language, fairy tale language, and the other its mechanism and something cold and reductionistic. I think there are two problems with it. First of all, it assumes, without perhaps realizing, dualism of the world. And that's, in my remarks, a position that I'm going to call into question. And so that's one point of view. It treats the questioner as if he's separate from the rest of the universe rather than a natural part and a natural expression of it. And secondly, it treats consciousness, that is to say the reality of the person who is questioning about the universe, again, separately from that which he questions. So consciousness versus matter as if they were dualistic or separate. And the question that one can raise, that arises, what is my role as a questioner, as an observer who wants to understand both the universe and myself, who am a part of it, who wants to understand the meaning, the role, the place, or as somebody said last night, what's the meaning of life or of my life in all this? I think there have been enough great physicists who have questioned the mechanistic interpretation, so much so that there is precedent for not accepting it without grave reservations. And the dichotomy that has sometimes been invoked is that there are two kinds of science. There are two attitudes, two ways of doing science. One is utilitarian, and it's been named Archimedean science, what Archimedes did when he discovered, the lever, and all the pragmatic spin-offs of that outlook on nature. And the other one has been called sacred science, Pythagorean science. These terms originally come from Bill Thompson, William Irvin Thompson, the cultural historian. And Pythagorean science is another sort of science. And it's the one that, at least in my own mind, I link to the notion of what we call the ancient wisdom. I think as far as historical figures, the Archimedean scientists are the behaviorists and people like Monod, Trefil, Sagan, Hume, Hobbes. Pythagoreans, I would consider obviously Pythagoras, Galileo, Bruno, Einstein, Schrödinger, Bohm, and people within that, on that wavelength. And so now I would like, therefore, to go back and pose some questions and even throw out some hypotheses. And I want to do this from a holistic perspective. I'm going to use some of the hypotheses, the hypothetical frameworks of Theosophy, because Theosophy, like other strictly non-dualistic systems, I think have seen the first of all, impossibility of falling between either anthropomorphic or reductionistic alternatives. And secondly, I think it fits into the idea of modern science. I'd like also, I think Dr. Ravindra brought up a fascinating question last night. Ancient wisdom. Why ancient? Wisdom, after all, is not in time. It's timeless. So why should we constantly add that phrase that sounds redundant? Ancient wisdom, almost tautological. I think the one reason for doing so that I could justify is that in the frequency of occurrence of people who looked at the universe, both with their mental intelligence, if you want to use that phrase, and with a kind of moral intelligence or intuitive intelligence. Buddhi is a very nice word for that. This perceptiveness. People who try to look at matter and consciousness from both these perspectives, they cluster more in the ancient world than they have in the modern world. And perhaps it is for that reason that the word ancient wisdom stuck and seemed a felicitous phrase, because except for a fairly new movement beginning in this century, a little bit earlier, maybe beginning of the last, I think the intervening epochs fail to produce the breathtaking visions of the connection between man and nature that you had much more often occurring in ancient times. And here I include all kinds of cosmologies, not just systematic investigations into nature, but I would include Hinduism, Buddhism, the views of the Buddha and people like that, as well as Pythagoras, Plato, and so on. Now, what did they teach? So I'm clustering all of those together with some theosophical hypotheses. In the first place, And I think all agree on that. And the three of us here are united, I think, on that perspective. Namely, and I'll just quote a little bit of the basic background in Theosophical metaphysics, that the source of everything and the source of ourselves is beyond being and non-being. It's boundless, it's infinite, and it cannot be, strictly speaking, known or named. It's the unknowable, it's the unnameable. That having been said, we are necessarily admitting that everything we do say about it after this first step has been made is going to be to some degree approximative and therefore metaphorical, obviously. However, that having been said, I think the non-dualistic systems point one's attention to the fact that from that source there arises everything else, and that includes matter and energy, which is treated as interchangeable in the ancient traditions as it is in modern physics, and consciousness. Matter and consciousness in these ancient systems have their root in one and the same reality, as they do, for example, in Spinoza. Therefore, the step that troubles so many dualists, how do you get them back together? What is their interconnection? That step need not be made in what I'm calling ancient wisdom, theosophical systems, Spinoza, people like that, because they never consent to the separation in the first place. Subject and object, consciousness and matter are all aspects, facets, but not so derivative of the primary reality, which cannot be named and known. They're all reflections of the source, and so on. So non-duality is axiomatic in this. The second thing is that, and again I take it from the theosophical literature, that we live in a world of constant process, dynamic activity, change. Buddhists call this anicca, a world which is totally alive, and therefore the kinds of predicates that Trefil use would not be applicable to that world. It would be, it could be said, and I would say that of that sort of ontology, that it hasn't gone deeply enough into things, or the law of change and its total dynamic thrust would become apparent, would become evident. Every particle of matter is somehow involved with consciousness, and all of that is ever changing. It's a change, however, and that's where the difference would come in from the mechanistic systems of today, at least, and from the mechanistic systems in the 17th and 18th century. It's a change that isn't random, chaotic, helter-skelter, but operates via certain laws which are held to be universal. And among these are harmonics, so we're going back to Pythagoreanism, almost a musical universe, every particle of matter for Pythagoras is musically, harmonically ordered and organized, is self-consistent, always within the groundedness of this deeper, nameless source. And incidentally, there is a hierarchic organization or ordering at all levels of being. The universe is not just drifting, as you have in Jacques Monod, whom I do know quite well, as opposed to Trefil, but they sound like philosophical cousins. So rather than man being an afterthought, a foreigner, a stranger, as you have in Camus and the existentialist, an outsider to the universe, he is a window upon it. He is the universe. He is not other than the universe. That follows from premise one, that consciousness and matter are ultimately aspects or expressions of one and the same underlying stuff. And the development of this creature within this wholeness is not either meaningless or redundant, or even for that matter totally unknown or puzzling, albeit it is a mystery, and I grant that, and I think Theosophy and Spinoza and all these systems do grant that. It is a mystery whose understanding is incumbent on us as searchers, as knowers. Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. To examine life to its ground, to its bottom, allows for the possibility that these sorts of laws will in fact be discovered. Not out there, because there is no outside or inside if you look at the universe non-dualistically, but rather within one's mind and heart, as the Upanishads would hold it. So there is then this universe. It's dynamic, interconnected, harmonic, musically ordered, if you like, going somewhere. Well, where? At the very least, going towards greater and greater self-awareness, self-clarification. And that seems to be the unique role or privilege of creatures such as ourselves. A human consciousness, and this has been said in different ways by different people. Spencer Brown, who's a mathematician, says it very interestingly. It's quoted in Ken Wilber's book, On the Spectrum of Consciousness, an excellent book, by the way, that Quest, in fact, has published. Spencer Brown says, perhaps the universe is the kind of entity or the kind of being, the kind of domain that needs to look back on itself, turn, as it were, reflexively towards itself in order to understand itself. And if that is the case, then the human being is uniquely equipped to do just that, to be the voice, the articulator of the universe, its window, that part of the cosmos. And I'm saying we are the cosmos. It's not out there and we're trapped in here. That part of the cosmos that looks back and questions itself and grasps itself and understands itself is what we are. That is the role of consciousness, if you will, among other things. And so this unknown, unknowable reality gets localized in some, at least temporarily, finite entity. We call that ourselves. And this then is the individual aspect of a consciousness, which is universal in its source. And in it, we move, we develop, we unfold. I'd be happy to use the words that are used in the ancient wisdom literature. You have a notion of periodicity, of a rhythm in all of nature, in the life of man as well, cycles, unfolding, movement, direction, thrust, all of that, and pilgrimage. I accept that word from the whole tradition of the East, Buddhist, Hindu, Theosophical, Platonic, pilgrimage of each creature, each individualized aspect of the cosmic consciousness, a spark, if you will, that seeks its own, increasingly, its own clarity, its own understanding, its own unfoldment, its own evolution, if you will. And so the notion here of evolution and involution makes great sense. You have it also in Sankhya, which is the underpinning of yoga philosophy, and in Theosophy, involution, where you might say you have a state of, somebody said, why, if it's also wonderful, was it broken up into parts? The one logical answer, hypothesis that one could give is that which was whole and was so perfect and was then broken up into multiplicity. You might say, though it was perfect, it might have been perfect in an unconscious way, just pure being, without perhaps knowing. That's dichotomy the medieval philosophers used a lot. And so in involving itself in outwardness, in the centripetal force, it went from an unconscious perfection to the human estate, which is consciousness, but very imperfect. So conscious imperfection. And the thrust of the cosmos, which is, going to be for millions and millions of years. We know barely anything, right? Philosophy, science are no more than 5,000 years old at best. So from unconscious perfection, you go to conscious imperfection to move eventually, one would think, to conscious perfection. Awareness of being aware, awareness of the connection between so-called inner and outer, between the essence of the thing and its working out, displaying itself in space and time and matter. And so enlightenment, you might say, is this direct awareness of both of these sets of features, the all and the one, the unity and the multiplicity, the self and the other, the figure and the ground, consciousness and matter. It's self-clarification, or the motion towards greater and greater wholeness, which at the same time is understood on some level of the questioner. This has ethical implications, which I don't have time to go into, but there are also, I think, in all this, some fascinating paradoxes. Ravi brought them up in his own way last night, and it fits into this cosmology. The subtle comes first and is more powerful and gives rise to the more grosser, dense kinds of matter. Why that should be is difficult to know, because science turns everything upside down, but that, I think, would be a consequence of this point of view. Consciousness almost precipitates matter, makes actual what is potential, and then after that first step has been made, matter in its specific form emerges, as science tells us, from the subatomic particle to the atom, to the compound, to the unicellular creatures and protozoa, all the way up through the vertebrates and finally to man. It seems to be going in that direction. The ancient wisdom traditions say yes, but that's the intermediate step. The primary step was that consciousness gave rise to the possibility of all that and created the necessary means to bring it about. I won't say, I think, very much more. I'd like to leave lots of room for discussion and questions. And so perhaps I have one more point to make, and then I will pass this on. I had a very nice quote here that I wanted to share with you from Mircea Eliade. And it makes the point, it goes back again to what we said yesterday. Where does it all come from, and what does it all mean? And Eliade says something that fits the point I'm making rather well. Quote, he says, "It is not a creation, nor a transcendence, nor the realization of new species of existence, but simply the realization of the potentialities that exist in matter." And so he says, the effect is an entity. It exists before the causal operation. All that can be brought about by the cause is the manifestation or development of the pre-existing effect. And so that's really what I'm submitting to you. Everything, the inner essence of this unfoldment is already present, but it needs to be worked out in space, time, and three-dimensional matter and form. And I think that, to me, is a view that makes more sense of our position in the universe than just the reductionistic Trefil and Monod position. Now, I'd like to stop, and perhaps because last night we started with Roger Jones, let's start with Ravi Ravindra this morning.
Rene, before I really make any remarks that I had myself thought about, I was very interested in one of the points you made about the possibility that the human beings are here as a window to aid the self-consciousness of the universe by itself. I wondered at that time whether you are aware of, or if you recall, there is I think a very nice poem by Shelley. It's called Hymn to Apollo, where this is in fact the theme of the poem.
I read it then.
The poem more or less ends, its last but 2 or 3 lines, I don't recall the whole poem, but the burden of that is, I am the eye through which the universe sees itself.
Exactly. Hymn to Apollo?
Hymn to Apollo by Shelley. This was in our high school curriculum in India, and I never knew what he was getting at that time. But it stayed in my mind. It's a bit of a shame, actually, I feel increasingly, how little sensitivity we seem to bring to poetry in general these days in our education, as if it's a mode that has completely escaped us. And I'm sorry to say, but it's my impression that it's partly because we have all this immense importance attached to this quantitative business. So anything in poetry just seems like vague and mushy and maybe nice for amusement, but it's really not the truth. That sort of impression one has got. Some of the remarks that I want to make are partly extension of what I said last time, but partly some of them will be a little new. First of all, really inviting us to think of something which is, it appears to me, an obvious observation, but the implications of this we rarely think about. Namely, how is it that the Chinese are Chinese, or the Africans are Africans, or the Indians are Indian, or Americans are American? What does it mean to say this, that somebody is Chinese? I suggest that if we took, let us say, 5 children by the age of 8 or 9 or 10, say 12 in any case on the outside limit, and one of them was from China, one from India, one from Africa, one from Europe, one from, let's say, USA, and they all were brought together and were shown a still life of some flowers and something else, and were asked to paint it, given also, let us assume for a moment, they have some talent in this. What to me is quite amazing, that almost everybody, even without any special sensitivity to art, could look at their paintings of the same subject and would say, this has been done by a Chinese kid, this has been done by a European kid, this has been done by an American. Now, a small point, but what does this really mean? That by the age of 12 at the outset, likely 8 or 9 or even earlier, a kid's whole perception of the world has been conditioned. Certain color schemes make sense to him, which we call Chinese or call European or Indian. Certain lullabies make sense to him. Certain musical rhythms make sense to him. And similarly, with regard to what is the purpose of human beings, or what is the purpose of knowledge, or generally speaking, whatever we may put under the label of the worldview, or a vaguely felt cultural cosmology, all this has actually been implanted in a person before puberty, in general. And to really break through this is practically a remarkable Copernican revolution for the individual involved. It requires an enormous amount of upheaval. And I'm suggesting to you, this is one reason why we need to ponder over this question, why are Chinese Chinese? Because already one sees how our whole perspective on the world is conditioned, mostly unconsciously. Some of it is perhaps conscious in the sense that others who are responsible for bringing us up may have been conscious about this. Children themselves are not necessarily conscious. Okay, now let me make one or two other similarly general remarks, because I feel some of these things are so plainly obvious that we need to just merely look at their implications, and we'll see how trapped one in fact is in the times in which one lives, in the culture in which one lives, in the language that one speaks, in the music that one grew up hearing, the chanting that one attended, whether it was in the temples or the mosques or the churches. All that conditions us. The other question I want to raise is, why are we really even concerned about what science has to say or doesn't have to say? For example, why don't we have seminars like Modern Plumbing and Ancient Wisdom? Or maybe a little bit more seriously, Modern Music and Ancient Wisdom, or Modern Art and Ancient Wisdom. Here I am making a distinction between art and music, which is only partly permissible, let's say visual arts. I submit to you that the reason why we are all so occupied with science is because of its power. This is true historically. There is a more or less complete correlation between the development of science and of technology and of capitalism and of military power. You are now all in a country where this is obviously so, particularly recalling that in the last 30-40 years, USA has totally dominated the world scene in science. Those of you who have had a chance to read this year's every Nobel Prize in every field of science, even the Nobel Prizes which were shared, all of them went to USA. And if one had to make a list, let us say last 30 years of Nobel Prizes, I haven't actually done this, but my own impression is, it'll be an interesting exercise for some undergraduate for a project to do, that my own impression is that easily 50% of all the Nobel Prizes in sciences, including medicine, because often the Nobel Prizes in medicine are not for just ordinary day-to-day humdrum medicine. They are really for advances in medicine. They are researches in medicine. So they are really scientific work as much as any. That I would say that more than half of the total Nobel Prizes in the last 25, 30 years have gone to USA. That is the period post-Second World War, so it will be probably nearly 40 years now, that USA has dominated the world scene of science and has dominated the world scene in military and has dominated the world scene in economics and technology. I'm suggesting to you that these things are so intimately related with each other that is really probably the only, if not the only, at least the major reason why we bother about science. It's black magic, power. And therefore, it becomes particularly important in a way to bother about it. In a way, I feel that the Theosophical Society has, in its wisdom, often organized seminars like this, because if anybody is interested in the question of wisdom, one thing one has to be interested in, is the relationship between wisdom and power. Every spiritual seeker throughout human history has been faced with this predicament. Whether you think of the absolutely classical cases like the temptations of Jesus Christ or temptations of the Buddha, those are so classical that they are not really close to us in some senses, but nevertheless they are archetypal cases. There is always the temptation of power, sorcery, black magic. And now what we are seeing here is, if you like, an institutional display on a large scale of black magic, without any requirement from any quarters, inside science or outside science, that this be in any sense balanced by any demand of wisdom, compassion, love, mercy. There is no demand of this kind. Therefore, I partly, in a way, always welcome the sorts of seminars that get organized, because this is, I have no idea whether this has been so self-consciously organized. But knowing Dora a little bit, I suspect she always sees things which none of us others see very easily, and that she may in fact be suspecting some such connections. But this also brings me to the point that to do great science, one is not required to have any particular quality of being. There is no requirement that a great scientist has to be a great human being. And whenever we speak about wisdom, whatever else we may be speaking about, we are, after all, speaking about quality of a person, quality of a human being. This has a little bit of a history behind this. As far as I have been able to determine this from my friends in the classics field, that in the history of Western philosophy, even a theoretical division or separation between being and knowing is more or less post Thomas Aquinas. That prior to that, for example, for Plotinus, this is going quite a ways back, or even after Plotinus, Proclus, Pseudo-Dionysius, or for others, this sort of division would make no sense. In order to know something deep, one had to be a deep human being. In order to know something great, one had to be a great human being. That not only that one had to be in any kind of a physical requirement, but it was just assumed that being, or speaking in a correlative, goodness and beauty and truth were so connected with each other that one could not exist without the other. Now, I don't think we have any reason to assume that that is the case, particularly since the 15th, 16th century, and as you well know, that the great the rise of modern science really dates from the 16th, 17th century. As Dr. Jones pointed out last night, there is in general, I think most historians would agree, there is always, of course, continuities with earlier times, but in general, one tends to date the beginning of the modern scientific revolution from 1543, which is the year of the publication of Copernicus's Orbium Celestium, the revolution of heavenly spheres. In fact, the English language has now acquired the current meaning of the word revolution precisely from that book. Otherwise, it meant, as it also now means, just to go around. But the idea that to turn something wholly on its head, that is largely, if you like, the contribution of that great book. But in any case, the revolution more or less really was brought to a culmination by the publication of Newton's Principia Mathematica Philosophia Naturalis, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, in 1687. That is, in general, most historians of science would say, that is the period in which, prior to which certain kinds of questions were asked, and after which certain other kinds of questions were asked. And that is the transition period. And more particularly, a kind of question that I would now like to return to is this, or a cultural effect of that. Prior to that period, and also in the beginning of this period, everything that anybody thought of, whether it was in what we would now say philosophy or physics, chemistry, any subject, sciences generally, all that thought had to be, in some senses, cleared with theology, particularly scriptures. And I think what has happened after this period, after Newton, anything written in any other field, whether it's philosophy or theology, has to be cleared with the sciences. And quite rightly it is said, I think Dr. Jones mentioned it last night as well, that the sciences now, or the scientists now, are the new priesthood. And I often feel that one should really add that the Nobel Prizes are the cardinals. Nobel Prize winners are the cardinals of this new church. But most of it actually, in fact, goes back to the scientific revolution of the 16th, 17th century. To be sure, in various societies, the effects of this are felt later. For example, in USA, 100 years ago, American physics, there was nothing especially to write home about American physics. And within approximately from about 1870 to 1945 is an absolutely remarkable transition in American physics. From being totally a third class or a fourth class nation as far as physics was concerned, it has become the dominant nation as far as physics is concerned. It's a great triumph of physics. So therefore, these kinds of remarks don't apply to every country in exactly the same period, but they nevertheless apply to all countries more or less successively. So what are we therefore speaking about? There is an enormous amount of power which is inherent in the very procedures of science and its technical application, and on the other hand, no demand that there will be or there should be any kind of a quality of being or wisdom be brought to bear on it. Thirdly, that it becomes more or less a self-referent system, that no other body of knowledge or any other persons, philosophers, theologians, or anybody else can have anything to say about what science is doing. Let me remind you, merely as a matter of historical record, practically every great thinker and artist in the Western world since Newton has been uneasy about the procedures and the assumptions and the effects of science. But it has not mattered one bit what they said. It's like a large ship or a large iceberg maybe moving in the ocean, and little fish are carrying on, thrashing around, trying to stop this. Nothing has mattered. But absolutely every major artist, philosopher, theologian has been uneasy about it. It is noteworthy that some of these small fish who haven't had any effect bear names like Wordsworth, Blake, Goethe, Hegel. These are not minor names. But the great ship of science, or the great iceberg of science, has moved on. And I think it's good for us to have a bit of a cultural sense about it.